Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We're now in our third season and more excited than ever to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show on extreme weather events, our second title in this topic, and today we're going to talk about wildfires. So why are we talking about wildfires as we talk about extreme weather events? According to the National Weather Service, although wildfires are not actually weather phenomena, they are related very significantly to weather, with most wildfires being caused by lightning, and as well, wildfires can cause their own weather. Wildfires in the form of bushfires, vegetation fires, forest fires, and grass fires are prevalent throughout the entire world, not just the ones we hear about here in the U.S. And recent high-profile events in Chile, Australia, and California have reminded the entire global community of the devastating effects that uncontrolled fire can cause. Widespread wildfires in the summertime, and now even springtime, are rapidly becoming the new normal in the American West. And along with the destruction and the loss of forests caused by blazes, there are immediate and long-term environmental impacts that dramatically affect our vital resources globally. The number of large wildfires in the U.S. has increased since the 1980s, and annual acres burned are projected to continue at an increasingly alarming level. Some western ecoregions now have year-round fire seasons. And in recent years, wildfires have made headlines as they blazed across the West, across Alaska, and Canada, burning approximately 10 million acres just last year, according to the National Interagency Fire Center. Wildfire, however, is a part of nature. It plays a key role in shaping ecosystems by serving as an agent of renewal as well as change. But fire can be deadly, destroying homes, destroying wildlife habitat and timber, and polluting the air with emissions that are harmful to human health. Fire also releases carbon dioxide, which is a key greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. And as you remember from previous shows, greenhouse gases are gases in the Earth's atmosphere that trap heat. They let the sunlight pass through the atmosphere, but they prevent the heat from that sunlight from leaving the atmosphere, thus causing global warming and climate change. And fire effects are influenced by forest conditions as well before the fire, as well as the management action taken or not taken after and during the fire, and all of these can be very long-lasting. Climate change, of course, has been a key factor in increasing risk and extent of wildfires in the western United States. Wildfire risk depends on a number of factors that we're going to discuss in more detail with our expert guest here shortly. And all these factors have a very strong direct and indirect ties to climate variability and climate change. Wildfires also significantly impact state and federal budgets, public health, and natural, environmental, and ecosystem health, as well as services. And then there are the health effects that are increasingly affecting more and more people that may not live in wildfire zones or that may not live in areas of immediate wildfire activity. And so not only are people forced to flee their homes in wildfires, but that smoke from the fires in the north and the west also threaten the lung health of Americans thousands of miles away. In fact, in one fire alone, Wildfire pollutants reach people in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa from flames in northern Canada. Wildfire smoke can be extremely harmful to the lungs, especially for children, for older adults, and those with asthma, COPD, bronchitis, or chronic heart disease or diabetes. And another significant health effect of wildfires is on mental health and psychosocial well-being, and that is very seldom talked about, but it's an ever-increasing issue that we are having to deal with. One of the most harmful pollutants found in wildfire smoke is particle pollution, or particulate matter, which is a mix of very tiny solid and liquid particles suspended in air. How tiny, you may ask? Well, many of the particles in wildfire smoke are no larger than 1/3 the diameter of a strand of your hair. And these particles are so small that they can enter into and lodge themselves deep into our lungs. Particle pollution can trigger asthma attacks, heart attacks, and strokes, and they can be deadly. The Yale Climate Connection calls it a silent calamity. Their research suggests that many more people likely perish from smoke exposure during large fire events than perish directly in the fire. And many, many more people are made sick, their researcher says. Professor Burke, a researcher with the Yale Climate Connection, calls the fine particulates minuscule and merciless. And another threat from forest fire smoke is carbon dioxide, which, as many know, is a colorless, odorless gas, most common during the smoldering stages of a fire and in close proximity to the fire. Inhaling carbon dioxide reduces the oxygen delivery to our body's organs and tissues, and it can lead to such things as headaches, dizziness. In high concentration, it leads to premature death. As well, wildfires spread many other harmful emissions. Another way that wildfires impact our health is by affecting the food supply chain, and this is often not thought of. Wildfires can impact the food supply even if you don't live in a wildfire zone, as wildfires annihilate farms and crops, causing supply shortages. In addition, the wildfire air pollution can impact the growth of other crops hundreds of miles away, as effects of air pollution can interfere with the photosynthesis and reduce crop productivity. And then, what about the retardant chemicals that we use to dump on the fires in an attempt to squelch them? Well, evidence is growing that this may have devastating impacts on aquatic ecosystems, including fish, such as salmon, that would typically contribute to our food supply. This is a lot, but here today to help us understand this more are three experts who have a great deal of knowledge. Who are going to try to help us unpack and understand this some more. First, we have Jay Balagna, and Jay is an assistant policy researcher at the nonpartisan RAND Corporation, and he's a doctoral fellow at the Party RAND Graduate School. Jay's research includes areas of disaster studies, disaster risk reduction and creation, the influence of climate change on disasters, climate-related and post-disaster mitigation, and the social determinants of health. And prior to joining RAND Corporation, Jay was a wildland firefighter in Nevada and Montana, as well as an emergency medical technician in Los Angeles. So he has a lot of on-the-ground experience. Welcome, Jay. Thank you for joining us. And did I get all of that right?
Yes, you did. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. And our other guest is Jim Whittington with Incident Services Company. Jim is a public information officer for more than 20 years, and he has responded to over 90 large and complex wildfires. He has been the spokesperson for incidents of national and international interest, including the Sierra Grande fire, the Rodeo Chedesky fire, the Wallow, and the Yarnell Hill fires. Jim advises federal and state agencies on incident management and risk and crisis communications, and assists state and local agencies in both pre-crisis planning and crisis communication. Jim started his career in Washington, D.C., in the office of Congressman George E. Brown Jr., and he has worked for the National Archives and Records Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, the United States Forest Service, the National Park Service, and the Bureau of Land Management. Jim's education includes a master's from the University of Virginia, as well as an undergraduate degree from our own University of North Texas. And both Jim and Jay recently authored an article this past August called "Climate Change is Only One Driver of Explosive Wildfire Seasons. Don't Forget Land Management." Thank you so much, Jim, for being with us today.
Good to be here with you.
Thank you. After the break, we're going to have another expert join us, Dr. Kristina Dahl. She is with the Union of Concerned Scientists. So, again, we really appreciate all of you all taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join us. And we're going to just jump into all of this on the other side of our break. But we're going to go to a break now, and thank you to the sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. First issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. And we're told with the best Christmas trees in Texas. Our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body and non-mercury. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. To today's show on extreme weather events, looking specifically at wildfires. And our very special expert guests today are, again, Jay Balagna with the RAND Corporation and Jim Whittington with Incident Services Company. Both experts, and they have jointly written an article talking about climate change and wildfires and issues concerning that. So we want to jump in, and I want to start out with you, Jay. If you can give us some basics before we get much further into our questions, to talk specifically or explain to our audience, what is a wildfire? You know, a lot of people think they know, but we want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. What is a wildfire, and then what are the effects and causes of wildfire?
Yeah, so when we use that term wildfire, what we're really talking about is obviously a fire, and not in an urban area, not in an urban setting. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be within a city. You might see, a large park. I live in Los Angeles. If there were to be a fire in Grove Park, we would probably call that, a wildfire, even though it is happening in the middle of the city limits of Los Angeles, because we have this multiple acreage, large mountainous sort of area. But it's sort of contrasted against what we in the firefighting world call structure firefighting, structure fires. So it's when a building is not the primary the primary incident. It can happen, as you said at the top of the segment, in forests, in grasslands, in any sort of wild ecosystem. It can also happen in what we call, I'm sure this term's going to come up a lot in this call, so it's a great time in this interview, so it's a great time to sort of define it now, but the wild and urban interface, which is going to be those sort of hinterlands of cities or of towns where you've got folks who are living right alongside, the wildlands, trees, empty grassland, wilderness. 50 million American households are in that wild and urban interface, and it's an extremely common space. It's an extremely complex space for emergency responders and firefighters to operate in. And so a lot of wildfires will happen in that interface area too, where those lines that I just sort of laid out between urban and wildland really start to blur together. So you might have a wildfire in a place that that does look quite urban happening in that interface space. But those are sort of the differentiating terms there.
Is this typically that area that's on the edges of large urban areas or cities as you begin to get out of them into the suburbs or beyond the suburbs? It's less densely inhabited?
Yeah, well, they could actually be quite densely habited still. And it's not just at the edges of large urban areas either. You'll see these in small towns. Oftentimes, small towns will exist entirely within the wild and urban interface. That urban term is a bit of a misnomer. What we're really saying is just, places people live. If there are like built infrastructure and town space. But yeah, you've kind of hit, I think, what we're talking about. You've drawn an accurate picture, but I would just say that don't limit it just to that.
I got you. What mostly causes wildfires?
When they're naturally caused, when you hear someone talk about a natural start or a natural wildfire, it's most often lightning. Lightning storms in the American West will often be, will occasionally not be accompanied by rain. And so oftentimes lightning storms will start great, large amounts of fire. Even when they are accompanied by rain, if they strike something that has the ability to hold some heat for a little bit of time, something like, say, a tree, they can hold a fire even through a little bit of light rain, and then the next morning that turn into a larger incident, a wildfire, or even if it doesn't, it still counts as a natural start wildfire. But then there are what are called human starts as well, and human starts cause a very large number of fires. Those can be things that are quite obvious, like campfires that escape or fireworks, but also things that are a little bit less obvious, like sparks from railroad tracks, sparks from vehicles. Oftentimes, if you're dragging a trailer behind a pickup truck and you've got those safety chains, if you don't have those tucked up underneath the vehicle, where they're supposed to be, those will drag along the side of the road. A large semi-truck with a spare, with a flat tire that it doesn't notice will often cause sparks as that rim rises against the pavement. Or wind will blow power lines against trees and other foliage, and that's actually an extremely common source of wildfires in Northern California. That's why you see electric utilities shut down power preemptively before a wind event. It's because they know that their power lines will blow against a tree, and they need to prevent that fire from happening because liability reasons, safety reasons, all the sorts of reasons that you wouldn't want it to start a fire.
So a lot of it is lightning and wind, so it's still weather. Because I was having a conversation with someone, and they asked me too, well, why is wildfire always talked about or categorized under that extreme weather event? And indeed, it seems that many of them, in the past anyway, have been caused by weather, lightning and wind, as you say, thunderstorms. Jim, do you know of any stats, though, in terms of causation as opposed to human negligence of weather or anything?
Yeah, so if we're looking at the nation as a whole, most states, the majority of wildland fire starts are human caused, particularly in the southeast and the south. You'll have a lot of folks who, clearing land, burning leaves, that kind of thing, where the fire gets away from them. And there's a little bit of a start there. In several western states, the primary cause is lightning. And I think probably when we're looking at the fires that get large, you're going to see more of those have lightning or be natural caused than human caused, because one of the things we see is a dry lightning storm comes through. We don't have the resources to get to every start. And so the one that is last on the priority list sometimes develops quickly and gets big fast. And so we run into that problem when we get a lot of multiple starts from lightning. We just can't cover everything at the same time. And so you have to make priorities, and obviously you take the ones closest to communities first, and then that leaves the ones further out, time to grow and get established, and then we have trouble.
Is that common, though, that the lightning is not going to strike just once, but when you have a lightning strike fire, it's striking multiple times?
Right, yeah. Anytime you have a dry thunderstorm move through, or even a wet thunderstorm, lightning can hit around the edges of it and not catch any rain. You're going to have multiple ground-based strikes. And depending on your conditions, and the West has been in drought conditions for a while now, and this year we had pretty much every state in the western U.S. in severe drought. When that lightning strikes, odds are it's going to find a receptive fuel bed to start a fire. So that's kind of where we've been for the last several years.
So there's a third weather determinant in wildfires, drought. We've
Absolutely.
mentioned lightning strikes, wind, and drought. And I want to talk some more about drought and how they cause wildfire, because I often hear drought associated or mentioned with wildfire really more than lightning.
Yeah, so I think, drought is going to be really important everywhere when you're talking about wildfire. Obviously, when we refer in the wildfire world to vegetation oftentimes as fuel, which is a little reductive, but we're talking about fire, and that's what it is in a fire context. When fuel moistures are low, which in a drought they inherently will be, and bigger, denser, usually wetter things like trees will have had time to dry out in a drought, you'll have bigger wildfires and greater risk for wildfire. But now, Bernice, you're in North Texas, and North Texas is not a place that oftentimes has very intense wildfire seasons. However, when it does experience periods of prolonged drought, that changes. And so oftentimes in parts of the country that don't live with this as an annual constant threat, like I do in California, the drought can kind of sort of change things. I spent practically an entire summer one year of my firefighting career in East Texas, which, like I just said, not a place that really experiences wildfire constantly, but drought changed that, and it made it a very severe wildfire zone for quite a while.
And I understand how drought provides or fuels the fuel for wildfire. But let me ask you this. I lived in Florida for a number of years. And when I lived in North Florida, a couple of times, they had this tremendous fire in the Daytona area. And I think it was peat fire. Is something like that considered a wildfire because it was significant, lasted a long time, and created a lot of damage?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the American South, you'll get these things called peat fires, where you've got that sort of thick organic layer called peat that will burn. Peat is burns quite well. Oftentimes, it's used as fuel for cooking, and various cultures have used it as such for a very long time. So when you get drought, that'll start to happen. You'll have peat fires that'll happen more often, and those are weird. They can actually burn underground for a while. Same with coal seams in various parts of the country where those can be where those are found. You'll have very interesting, unique fire behavior that can be quite dangerous and unexpected because of the way those fires can sort of burn underground and smolder around unnoticed. But yeah, exactly. Those droughts can really change the moisture content of that peat layer and make it much more susceptible to fire.
You've got the peat fires in the southeast. You've got the forest fires and all kinds of fires in California and the West. And we've got just 1 minute before we go to break. And so I want to start with you, Jim, though. In terms of this, are there other areas of the U.S. that have their own particular fire issues or fire occurrences?
Well, if you look at what we call the fire year, it typically starts early in the year in the southeast in Florida, and then kind of moves across to the southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas by March, and that fire season lasts till June or early July, when the monsoonal moisture comes in to the southwest, and then we see fire start to pick up in the Great Basin and the Northern Rockies and the Pacific Northwest, and then we typically end in November and December in California, and then we get right back on it again. That's why we're starting to think of things as a fire year instead of a fire season. But that's the normal trajectory of the fire year. But we're seeing changes to that, obviously, with the changing conditions that the climate's bringing, and some of those regions aren't staying within their bounds or their historic bounds, and so we're getting more regions online at the same time more often now.
It's moving way, way beyond California, which is where most people typically think about it. Indeed, we're going to go to break now. We'll be back on the other side to dive deeper into this very interesting conversation. Thank you. We have been with Jim Whittington with Fire Incidents Company and with Jay Balagna with the RAND Corporation. Thank you. We'll be right back on the other side. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. to today's show on extreme weather events, talking specifically about wildfires. And we have established in the first part of the show that the reason wildfires are categorized under those extreme weather events, even though they're not actually weather phenomena, is that they're mostly caused by lightning, which is a weather event, by wind, and by drought. It seems as though from our conversation that there's still more human interaction than there should be. And we are back with Jim Whittington with Incident Services Company and with Jay Balagna with the RAND Corporation. And again, thank you all for being with us. Jim, before the break, you were talking to us, but I want to ask you, Jim, you've responded to over 90 large and complex wildfires. What has been your biggest takeaway in your 20 years of wildfire management in terms of what you've seen?
Well, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, wildland fire is incredibly complex and influenced by any number of factors: topography, vegetation, road networks, community development, and on and on and on. However, I think what we're seeing is that the climate change part of it is becoming more and more prevalent and becoming a much bigger factor than any of the others. And I think that leads to a number of issues. One is the length of the fire year that we were talking about, right? Traditionally, when many of the systems that we put in place to fight wildland fires were developed, it was the middle of the 20th century, and we didn't have these long duration fire years. We didn't have these long duration, extremely large wildland fires. And so that puts a lot of stress on both people and systems trying to work those fires, protect communities, and protect natural resources. And the other thing that the changing conditions do is it really plays with your experience level, because you're seeing things that haven't been seen before, fire behavior that hasn't been seen before. For example, we had not known of fires that start on the west side of the Sierras and burn up to the top and down the east side before this year, and this year we had two. So when it comes to decision making, you can no longer rely on your past experience, and that creates uncertainty and that creates delays in decision making. And the last thing you want to do during an emergency is take time to really think through your decisions. You want to be as quick as you can. And so that's kind of the larger intellectual issue of it. But I think the other thing is that, we're just seeing larger fires with higher intensity and longer duration on the landscape. And those things are becoming more common. When I first started, 7,500 acre fire was a big fire. And now it's routine to have a 100,000 acre fire or bigger.
Indeed. Every year we keep hearing that the fires out west are getting larger and larger. This year it was larger than last year, and so on and so forth. So it is getting much worse. And I want to go ahead and introduce our other guest who's joining us, who can help us understand why they're getting so much worse. Our other guest is Dahl, and Kristy is with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Kristy is a senior climate scientist for the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And in her role, she designs, executes, and communicates scientific analysis to make climate change more tangible and more understandable for the general public and to policymakers. Prior to joining the Union of Concerned Scientists, Kristy was the Associate Director of a school-wide climate change initiative at Rutgers University. She also served as a science communicator for Al Gore's Climate Project. Thank you, Kristy. We're glad that you could join us.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And I want to jump right in with you to really help us understand some of what other two experts have been telling us. And as you just heard Jim saying, the fires are getting bigger, badder, worse, more intense. Why is that?
Absolutely. So by almost any metric, when you look at wildfires and what's happening worldwide, we see that they're getting worse. They're getting larger. The fire season's getting longer. The fires are burning at higher elevations, and they're more intense. And all of those come back to the issue of climate change. So climate change is making our wildfire seasons longer, making the fires burn more intensely for a number of reasons. But the primary one is that as we warm our planet, we warm and dry out all of the vegetation, the plants that serve as fuel for wildfires. So that's specifically what's been happening out here in the West. As we've seen the western part of our country warm because of climate change, we've seen the vegetation get drier. It's exacerbated drought conditions out here, so that when a spark does occur, you're more likely to get a large, intense wildfire than you used to be.
And I think Jay wants to weigh in on that. Then I want to ask you all about something else I've heard about fire behavior.
Yeah. And I just want to add to it. I think not only are wildfires getting bigger, getting worse for all those reasons that were just mentioned, more people are also exposed to them. I mentioned earlier that 50 million households in the United States are in that wildland-urban interface. That's a number that increases by 1 million every 3 years. And that's something that's a direct result of policy choices that we've made in our communities in this country. The rising cost of housing and of living in urban areas pushes people further and further out into those spaces where they have direct exposure to wildfire.
Indeed. Kristina?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really important to keep in mind here that the vast majority of wildfires are sparked by human causes. It's more than 80% of them. And so when you have more people living in wildfire-prone areas, that means that you have more chances of getting a spark that's going to spark a wildfire. And when that fire occurs, there are more people there to be potentially impacted by it. So it's absolutely a big part of the problem.
A couple of things, though, I want to query you all about, and that is I've been told that air temperature, moisture content, and nighttime fire behavior has something to do with all of this. Jim, can you talk to us a little bit about the effects of those three things?
Sure. One of the things that firefighters have traditionally depended on is what's called nighttime recovery, where relative humidity rises at night as the sun goes down and darkness sets in. What we're seeing across the West, and again, it's not just California, it's across the West, and as Kristy mentioned, and increasingly across the world, is that those nighttime recoveries aren't happening like they have traditionally happened. And so that means you have more active fire behavior at night, more aggressive fire growth at night, and an inability to take some of the suppression actions that we would have traditionally taken on fires. Like nighttime was usually the best time to do burnouts, where we build a line and we burn out from that line to take fuel away from the oncoming fire. If you're trying to burn out, but you're getting spotting across the line and you can't hold it, then that's not a good thing. And that's kind of the conditions that we're facing sometimes during these nights of low humidity and seemingly high winds as well sometimes.
Indeed. And Jay, could you talk to us a little bit about the economic impacts of wildfires?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're vast and they really differ based on where in the world we're really talking about. I grew up in a small town in the Great Basin, and wildfires meant a loss of grazing land for the folks that I grew up around that made their livelihoods ranching. It also interrupted mining activity and other sort of resource extraction out of that territory. Jim mentioned earlier one of those fires that crossed the crest of the Sierra Nevadas. One of those was the Calder Fire. That impacted Lake Tahoe to a huge degree, and the tourism industry there is a massive part of the economy. Not only is it going to impact or harm and reduce that economic activity for tourism while that fire is burning, but it's going to harm that tourism activity for years into the future. You see the economic impacts of a wildfire in a tourism space like that increase the seasonal variability of employment for years afterward. You mentioned earlier some of the effects that it can have on agricultural activity as well. It really depends on where we're talking about and what we're talking about exactly. You can interrupt supply chains. You can interrupt public utility provision. The economic impacts are, like I said, vast and really diverse.
Thank you for helping us out with that. But before the break, I want to talk wildfires in other areas. So, Jim, can you talk to us a little bit about that in terms of wildfires globally? Yeah,
I think again, with the changing conditions, you're seeing more countries come online for wildfires. And again, the fires are getting larger and more complex and more intense than have traditionally occurred in these countries. We traditionally think of the United States, maybe Australia, Canada, maybe Russia as the big wildland fire countries, but we're starting to see those fires, overwhelm resources in places like Spain and Portugal, France, Greece, any number of countries across the globe. And again, we see that countries who haven't had these kinds of experiences don't have the capacity to deal with these kinds of fires yet. So I think there's probably going to need to be some kind of exchange and some kind of international cooperative effort to standardize wildland fire issues and work them as we go forward.
Yeah, Kristi.
And one of the really important things about the expansion in wildfire that we've seen, across the world, but particularly in places like Russia, is that they really have global impacts. So in high latitudes in Russia, you have these incredible boreal forests, and those are a huge sink for carbon dioxide. They basically suck that carbon dioxide out of the air. So as we're burning those forests and losing those landscapes, we're releasing additional carbon dioxide into the air, which then exacerbates global warming. So it's really important to recognize that all countries are really in this together, even if you're not directly experiencing someone's fire or the downstream smoke effect from it. It does affect our climate overall.
Thank you so much for bringing that point, Kristi. And we're going to go to break now. And after the break, we will continue to talk to these three smart people to help us understand this fairly complex subject. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. And we're told the best Christmas trees in Texas. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, none mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on extreme weather events, and we're talking about wildfires as an element of our extreme weather events. And we are back with Jim Whittington with Weather Incidents Company, with Jay Balagna with the RAND Corporation, and Kristina Dahl with the Union of Concerned Scientists. And they are all making us much, much smarter. So thank you all for taking time to be with us today again. One of the things I've read that I didn't quite understand, and so I'm thinking others don't either, is that they say that wildfires can cause their own weather, and that the weather affects wildfire, but wildfires also affect weather. Help us to connect the dots, and we'll start off with Kristi on that.
Yeah, so in the recent years, we've seen some really fascinating and terrifying behavior around wildfires. So these fires are burning so hot that you can actually get cumulus clouds of wildfire smoke billowing up. And that within those, you can get your own weather systems. And so we are seeing increasingly that these kind of extreme wildfire events are creating, weather that a lot of climate scientists haven't seen before. And that weather can get sort of transported across the country from California to places, as far as the East Coast of the United States, through our broader weather systems, like our jet stream, which is current of air that brings a lot of weather from west to east across the country. So again, what happens in California doesn't necessarily stay in California.
That is so weird. Do I understand you to say that in California they can cause these clouds that then travel, and I'm assuming the clouds then cause rain or storms wherever it is they're traveling to?
Yeah, they're not so much clouds where we think of clouds as being, moisture and water vapor. These are clouds of smoke that have some similar behaviors to what we see in normal clouds. In particular, that really fine particulate matter that you can't see and that is actually separate from the smell of the smoke,
right?
But is what is really harmful, particularly for kids' lungs when they breathe it in.
But Kristy, as a scientist, what is the potential, or what have we seen as to how far this can travel?
Well, certainly this past summer, we saw wildfire smoke from the western U.S. and western Canada all the way out in New York City. And for many weeks, the air quality where I live in San Francisco was actually better than where my family in Massachusetts lives. And it was really just a product of the fact that that's, where the winds were blowing. Certainly in past years, the winds haven't been in my favor, and we've had, a month or more continuously of air quality alerts due to wildfire smoke. So, it really kind of depends on what the prevailing weather is and where the fires are burning.
Interesting. Jim, I want to call upon you as a long-term fire and weather incidents communicator. What do you see in terms of communicating to people, or what has just been your experience in terms of the smoke from these wildfires traveling to other areas, and how is it looked upon?
Well, first of all, let me note that it's not just the U.S., right? I live in Oregon, and it's not unusual for us to get pulses of Siberian smoke coming across into the Pacific Northwest. So it's a global phenomenon. In terms of messaging, the closer you are to the source, the more dangerous the smoke is. So it's most dangerous for firefighters who are working on the line. And then as the particulate matter kind of drops out as the smoke transports, your communities that are closest to the fire are kind of next at risk, and then it keeps going out after that. So what we do is we try to target those communities that are closest to the fires and make sure that they're aware that, the air quality will be poor. We monitor the air quality constantly around large fires and try to get people who have health issues in touch with support services that they can make use of to prevent themselves from getting, serious exposure to smoke.
And speaking of health issues, Jim, can you talk to us a little bit about what the smoke impacts are that are contributing to firefighter and public health?
We've had a number of studies that have come out in recent years about the health impacts to firefighters from smoke, and every one of them has been bad. We traditionally thought that wildland fire smoke was nothing more than just a little campfire smoke, and it wasn't really harmful. But we're seeing that more and more studies show that the particulate matter and the kinds of things that firefighters are breathing is bad. And I think what's going to happen is we're going to have to change some of our strategy and tactics to limit exposure of firefighters to smoke on the line, which may conversely mean fires go a little bit longer, or we can't treat them the way we traditionally have, and have to change expectations in the public about maybe the length of time fires are going to be on the landscape. So it's a tough question. It's a really tough question.
Indeed. And Jay, I think you have some experience in that area as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to kind of add on that a lot of those effects that Jim mentioned are because of the different equipment and tactics that wildland firefighters use, as opposed to what someone might imagine a firefighter to be if they're thinking of a structure firefighter. When we work in wildland fire, we don't carry around those self-contained breathing apparatus, those SCBA, the breathing masks with the air tank. The most protection that you might have from smoke is a bandana tied across the lower half of your face. And even then, I mean, it was pretty rare to even see those. For the most part, you're right there breathing smoke, and you're breathing smoke right alongside the fire. It's long been seen in the wildland fire world that direct attack is the safest way to fight fire because of various, safety concerns around burnovers and things like that. It seems a little counterintuitive, but it's safest to be right alongside that fire. As Jim mentioned, those tactics might change, and one of the ways they might change is the expanded use of indirect attack. So separating firefighters away from that flame front, and that's just going to mean that fires are going to get bigger because all of that space in that indirect, the indirect attack is happening farther away from that flame front, and we're basically writing off all of that territory in between in doing so.
That is a significant way that it will impact everyday citizens that they probably won't understand when it comes to their door. I probably wouldn't. Let me go back to Kristy and ask, you've mentioned that a need for major infrastructure investments to prevent these extreme weather events, including wildfire. Can you talk to us about that? What type of infrastructure investments would help us prevent this?
Yeah, so when it comes to wildfire and a lot of other types of extreme weather, the key is going to be getting out ahead of the disasters before they happen rather than simply responding to them when they do. And, that's the same for if it's a fire as if it's a hurricane or a major flood. We really need to be building our community level resilience to these types of disasters, because the sad truth is that they are not going to be getting better anytime soon. So when I think about infrastructure improvements for, wildfire, we're looking at a big range of things. So this could mean things like doing prescribed burns to help reduce the amount of dry vegetation that's out there and low brush. It can also mean looking at how we are constructing our houses and our neighborhoods and making sure that we are using best practices like having a defensible space around your home so that you don't get vegetation burning right next to your home that can then spark flames in your house directly.
That's a lot to think about. And Jay?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Kristy was speaking to something that Jim and I, along with our colleague Erin Clark-Ginsberg, wrote in that piece that you mentioned at the top of this
right.
the whole segment about the ways that we can kind of deploy a lot of those, as she sort of described them, infrastructural solutions to attacking this before it becomes a disaster. I think a big part of that as well is with things like prescribed fire, it's important to recognize that a lot of that is rooted around historic knowledge of indigenous peoples that we need to be bringing back into the system. A lot of the issues that we're dealing with wildfire right now are sort of a result of the 20th century paradigm with which we've fought fire for so long that Jim mentioned about how this is something that's really has its roots in the early 20th century, came around as sort of this post-war suppress all fires at all costs as quickly as possible paradigm. And we really need to treat fire as the natural part of the ecosystem again and reintroduce it where possible, allow it to exist where possible so that it's not a big, giant disaster every time it does happen.
Sounds like you all are saying, too, we need to go back to some of the natural ways. Nature gave us a lot of ways to help and take care of us and itself. In terms of what you're saying, it seems like to me you're saying we need to go back to some of those, and having not done those is causing some of the problem. Briefly, Kristy, we've got 1 minute, and we're going to let you have the last word.
And I'd also say that, wildfire isn't happening in isolation in California or anywhere else. And so we also need to be looking at things like California's housing crisis, which, as their guests mentioned, is part of what is putting so many people in harm's way when fires do burn. So we need to be looking at things like housing affordability and building more housing in places that aren't wildfire prone, so that people don't feel they need to flock to them in order to live affordably and safely.
And we're experiencing something similar here in North Texas. And I imagine many other urban areas where the building, the neighborhoods, the subdivisions, people are living further and further and further out, encroaching upon, I think, what Jay called that wildland-urban interface. Well, thank you so much. You all have really made us smarter and helped us to understand first why wildfires are considered part of extreme weather events and how they are affecting all of us and why we must all care about them. Because that smoke, those smoke plumes with particulate matter that get down into the deep crevices of our lungs, it's coming for all of us. It's all over us. And it's coming not just from the west to the southeast, but as Jim mentioned, from other parts of the globe. So again, thank you all for helping us understand that. Thank you for being with us today. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day, like yourselves. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you, and join us again next week for more on extreme weather events. Thank you, listeners.